Good evening. My name is Michael Appel. I work at Avalon Housing, which is a local nonprofit provider of affordable and supportive rental housing. I'm unfortunately the first of the panelists who, despite Laura's best efforts, failed to send my remarks in time for her to send them to you, so I have some copies up here. It gives you the opportunity to decide you never want to hear or remember what I said, and then you don't have to come up and take it, but I did bring copies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing market and what has happened, because I think understanding not just what happened, but the implications it has for us and for our communities is a good starting point for how could housing be thought of differently in ways that are more sustainable and perhaps less likely to dive into these kinds of crises that ripple throughout not just housing, but throughout people's entire lives. So the dramatic drop in real estate property values undermine long-term financial security for many households, because home ownership in this country has been the single most important means of accumulating assets. And it's assets that do more for intergenerational financial stability than increased income. So when people think of not just their future, but their children and stability, at the short term, you think about income. But in reality, if you compare communities and you compare over generations, income tends to get spent fairly quickly. Assets stick around, and it's the drop in the value of that asset that made the real estate market crash really so frightening for so many people. But foreclosures threaten the financial and social fabric of certain neighborhoods, which are so heavily impacted by it that this personal financial crisis turns into a communal one, because the neighborhood itself no longer has households that can afford not just their day-to-day costs, but in fact their long-term stability is undermined. And while Ann Arbor is less subject to that than many areas, certainly the eastern part of Washtenaw County, Ypsi Township, have some neighborhoods with dramatic levels of foreclosure. And if you get into the larger urban areas in Michigan, you see it even more so. Rental foreclosures, where the owner is being foreclosed on and the renters, who may have been paying their rent the entire time, suddenly lose their housing, can displace some of the poorest families who have the fewest alternatives. Now, sort of the side effects in the work I do, federal incentives for low-income housing have been driven by tax codes recently. Private money is invested with a group like Avalon. We build housing with it. The investors get federal tax credits. Two things have happened. One, our real estate isn't such a reliable long-term investment anymore, so they're less likely to invest in it. But secondly, if they don't project profits going 10 or 15 years into the future, why would they give money now for future tax benefits for themselves? And so that method of financing housing, which has been the most important for the last couple of decades, dramatically dried up. The loss of jobs resulting in lower incomes threatens to destabilize rental housing, both privately owned and subsidized, through higher vacancies. People can't afford to pay rents, and suddenly owners who have relatively fixed costs find that their housing, it doesn't work. And I'm not talking about speculative housing here, although the same happens in speculative settings. Simply rents don't cover costs when your vacancy rate is too high. And government housing agencies don't have the long-term resources to fill the gaps in struggling housing developments. So nonprofit housing or privately subsidized housing, where we made certain long-term assumptions, we capped our rents, and now those assumptions are proving untrue. Particularly in a state like Michigan, the government right now is in no position to step in and really help at the scale that the housing industry is experiencing crisis. So some of the opportunities that I think this moment provides. Much of the stimulus money that is being talked about constantly is, in fact, going into the housing sector for obvious reasons. It's the housing sector that in many ways undermined the economy. Now, the irony of this is that the cure isn't really focused on housing as a place to live, because that's not the crisis, or at least that's not the economic crisis that our government is trying to cure. The government is trying to cure the problem with housing as an investment and housing as the cornerstone of assets in our economy. And so one of the challenges, I think, is to relook at that balance, housing as a place to live versus housing as an investment. For the vast majority of people in the United States, our housing system works until you get these occasional crises. And even now, most people are not, it's not their immediate housing that's threatened, it's their long-term investment and economic stability that's threatened. Some people obviously have their immediate housing threatened. So I think as we rebuild housing policy, there's very interesting and difficult questions about the difference between home ownership and rental, about security of tenure and whether that has to be synonymous with ownership, and financial security. Is using housing to build assets a smart policy? What are the risks for us? And then lastly, using this opportunity as we reinvest in housing, and here I'll touch on things you've heard from other panelists, thinking about energy efficiency, urban design, coordination with transportation and jobs, so that we don't rebuild the kind of sprawl suburbs that may work well in certain kinds of investment strategies, but leave our economy very vulnerable. And you can see when it unwinds quickly and spreads throughout.